Thank you very much. Indeed, I'm going to explore something that is a little bit out of my comfort zone because as a historian, I rarely talk about contemporary times or future times. But this is part of a broader project that Sina and I are working on in Vienna on the politics of the Anthropocene. And I'm very happy today to brainstorm with you this work in progress and lay some kind of big questions and see how you react, and hope to pick your brain with it. And let's start with recent events. Some of you might know that in September, Mario Draghi, whom you might recognize here as the former Prime Minister of Italy and former President of the European Central Bank, presented a report that was commissioned by Ursula von der Leyen about European competitiveness and the future of European economy in the contemporary world. And I want to dive in very quickly in some key points of that report, because this is how the Draghi report features the place of Europe in the world economy today. And you see two things on that graph. You see first that the two main competitors are China and the US, and that they're all organized around what we call the good old GDP to identify who is doing what in this world. Following with the GDP indicator that is telling us where Europe stands in the world economy today, you can see the projections and how Draghi just is very upset and aware that Europe is lagging behind China and the US, and that's the main preoccupation of this report. The problem is that Europe is lagging and that it needs to be boosted so that it could compete with the US and China. One of the main challenges that is underlined in this report is the problem surrounded by the crisis of energy. That's obviously part of why European industry is so lagging, and because energy prices in Europe are extremely high, particularly since the beginning of the war. And that's part of what Draghi decides to discuss throughout this report to try to propose solutions. And just a last slide, just to give you this sense of how Europe is lagging behind the US and China, because China is actually providing all the technology to access renewable energy when the US is on its own course on energy dependency that is obviously not affected by the war as Europe is facing right now. Two things that you have to have in mind to understand why China and US are on different paths and why it is challenging for Europe. One is that the Chinese government, it's been like almost 20 years now, has been defining a millennial goal for itself, which is to become an ecological civilization. That's kind of the term and the concept of Chinese policy now. So the objective of the Chinese government that is driving really highly the industrial development in China really wants to set this objective for China to become this ecological civilization, and henceforth has been funding massively all the development of the industry of renewable energy tools. So whenever you have a solar panel or a turbine, wind turbine, in 98% of the cases, it comes from Chinese factories. When in the US, the path is different because we've been talking about some of it yesterday. The shale revolution in the US has put the US in the first position of world exporter of oil right now. So the US is also becoming a petrostate, even with the narrowest definition of a petrostate. So Europe doesn't have that. It doesn't have the resources to become a world exporter, energy exporter, and it doesn't have this secular or millennial objective to become an ecological civilization. Maybe it's a good thing when Europe doesn't decide to become anything civilization anymore, but still that's a little bit the terms of the problem right now. So what does Europe do in the middle of all this? Obviously, okay, there is a problem. Instead of this black tab, it's supposed to be saying the Kyoto Protocol. So that's the title of this slide. Anything that happens in Europe concerning environmental treaties and environmental coordination is not just a European story, absolutely not. The European Union is not the first to invent anything related to climate negotiation and mitigations. It is the result of a very long international history that I just need to say that is not just a Western history. The first countries that have been trying to push for negotiations for resource protection and environmental protections were actually not from the global north. But it's a very long history of international negotiations since the Second World War, and it has evolved massively from a discussion about the protection of resources to a discussion about the protection of the environment. But if we have to take like one specific date that then determines a lot of very concrete decisions, it would be the Kyoto Protocol. That was a binding treaty, so binding that the US retrieved from it a few years after signing it. But it was one of the first time when really the international community decided to actually adopt for specific solutions, namely to reduce carbon emissions, because at some point the whole discussion about climate in international settings has been focusing really specifically on carbon emissions. It is not because scientists have hierarchized different environmental problems. It is not because heads of states have thought that really it was the best option to do. It's really because of a series of crises, of acid rain, of toxic fog, and so different international opinions or whatever have been pressuring some of their governments to actually take action, because inhaling carbon emissions obviously is immediately perceived as a problem, and like other types of pollutions that are more insidious in your bodies. But long story short, part of the solutions that have been suggested and adopted by the Kyoto Protocol were threefold. You had the idea that you should create carbon sinks. So carbon sinks, the idea is to just absorb these emissions naturally. So that would be planting trees, because trees absorb carbon, okay? The Clean Development Mechanism, it's a national investment mechanism that invites countries from the global north that have a history of pollution since the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, but actually we can talk about the first deforestations in the 16th century. It's a very long history of depletion and colonialism. But, well, basically the idea is that you have a list of countries that have been polluting for a very long time. And you have a list of countries that are currently polluting because of industrial development needs. And you can't put them all in the same list because they don't have the same responsibility historically. And because of that, the global north has to invest money in the global south to help the global south create carbon neutral or carbon reduction industrial projects, so that the Clean Development Mechanism. And finally, you have the emission trading system that is a market-based solution, so that companies and countries would have a market incentive to reduce their carbon emissions. The EU really adopted, sorry, it's just a list of countries that are Annex B, Annex A. If you want very much details about that, I can give you that. But Europe has been choosing this third solution, the market-based solution, to try really to reorganize its policies to try to reduce carbon emissions. And I'm just going to walk you through very quickly how do emission trading system work. And it's a little bit ironical I'm doing this because my conclusion is going to be, I tell you straight away, that it's the creation of an artificial market. But just so you have an idea and you don't go out of this talk being like, oh, she talked about this, but I still don't have any clue what it is. No, the emission trading system is something that allows the European Commission to set cap on the total amount of greenhouse gas emissions allowed for covered sectors. And based on this cap, the European Union sets the number of allowances that will be issued during the year. So you have like free credit given to companies that are polluting and a cap above which they can't pollute anymore without paying anything. That was emission of allowances. Now you're in the surrender of allowances. So in September of each year, industries must surrender to the European Commission as many allowances as CO2 emitted during the year. Otherwise, they have heavy fines imposed. And so far, the compliance is almost more than 90%. So this is really working in terms of contractually, it is working. Then you have to price carbon, because how do you relate carbon emissions with money? By pricing carbon. So these allowances, they can be bought, sold, or traded among participants. And you can purchase them at daily auctions. So you have a primary market where industries purchase carbon allowances directly to the European Commission, or you have a secondary market in which industries can trade allowances among themselves. So if one industry has been polluting more this year, they can buy allowances from an industry that has been polluting less compared to the cap set at the beginning. I hope you're all following me, but the idea is that you have a carbon price that is a trade-off value for decarbonization investments, and the idea is that there is money generated from that, and that it should, but actually it's not contractual to do so, be invested in some kind of ecological transition. But it's not binding to do so, so actually it's not really working like this. Long story short, you have this artificial market that has been created by the European Commission to fix market failures in the rest of the system, because apparently the industrial markets are not fit to incentivize companies to not emit carbon emissions. Okay, so with this mechanism, the idea is to have carbon emissions on the European territory by 2030 and to reach some kind of net zero. That's the big slogan, the net zero carbon neutral industry in 2050. If you want to have an idea of what industries are the most touched by this emission problems, this is a map of Europe where and just want to add something about maps and geography. Europe is the biggest continent on the planet that has the biggest exclusive, I have trouble to find this word in English, the exclusive zone in the oceans. Do you all picture what I mean? Because when you see this map, you're like, oh yeah, this is Europe. No, Europe has territories absolutely on all the continents and in all oceans on this planet. When we're talking about the environment, when we're talking about the protection of oceans, when we're talking about emissions, this is absolutely massively important. So I should put a map of the world, but then you wouldn't see precisely that is Germany and Poland, et cetera, that have the most polluting industries compared to, I don't know, France, because it has nuclear and no industry anymore since the 80s, et cetera. But I just want you to keep that in mind, because when we talk about Europe and the European Union, please do have a world map in mind and not just this very small map. The emission trading system in Europe is not the only one on this planet, because since the Kyoto Protocol, other countries have been trying to implement it. what I show you here is, I don't know if you read that well. Yes, you do. It's an implementation of this system by industrial sectors. So, for example, Europe is not doing anything in, let's say, transport. When the good guy is New Zealand, and I have to say, the producer of this graph is the New Zealand government. So this is, but well, you have an idea here of the gap between the rhetoric, because if you interview, which is what I do, because how else would you access information on this kind of contemporary topics? I'm a historian, I'm lost, so obviously I have working archives around me. I talk to my archives. I talk to people who have been implementing and creating the European trading system. They will all tell you, this is the best, it's working so much, we're the best, we're the leading, we're leading the world towards this path. So not really, but I guess the New Zealand government would say otherwise. So you have different sectors, and they're not all involved in this scheme. The objective is to involve all industrial polluting sectors so that they could also participate in this market incentive system to reduce carbon emissions. And the market-based solution is not the only one in this planet. You also have tax systems that are targeting carbon emissions. If you tax very heavily carbon emitters, it's also an incentive for them to try to diverse their production. And so that's the state of what the countries are trying to do. And you see that some countries are not trying to do anything, and others are trying and combining these systems. I just want to pause a little bit here on this question of tax versus carbon versus market solutions, because actually in Europe, the story is that originally it was supposed to be a fiscal system, but in Europe, in the European Union, it's not possible to implement a fiscal system because of the unanimity rule. You need to have all member countries to vote for the same fiscal law, and obviously it never happened. So originally, the president of the Commission, Jacques Delors, wanted to try to circumvent this fiscal problem by trying with the environmental discussion and to introduce some kind of European fiscality. He was not really interested in the environment. He was interested in creating a union, fiscal union. So he thought it would be strategic to use the environment as to open the door of the fiscality debate. It did not work. But so because of that, he met Al Gore, the almost US president, who was one of the most vocal in the US for the Kyoto Protocol and to create a flexible system. So that's the US version of the European trading system. And it ended up, obviously, in this not ideal system, but as part of really a discussion, a collaboration between the US and Europe. I want to go very quickly into something else, and I know I have 3 minutes left, and I thought, of course I have time to talk about absolutely everything, but I'm so passionate, I am just too talkative. I want to just give you, just like, keep everything that I've told you in mind, and then we're just going to step aside for a second to think of the first slide I showed you, how the Draghi report pictures what is going on and where Europe is in the state of the world economy. He used the GDP as an indicator of where Europe stands, and based on this, what Europe should do to decarbonize its economy. And I want to reflect a little bit on that, because if we ask what economy do we envision for a peaceful and a carbon neutral Europe, we need to understand what language do we use to define what is the economy. And obviously it's a huge question, but let's not be shy and let's ask that question to be like, okay, if we are still using in 2024 the GDP as an indicator for the health of an economy, then let's talk about how do the environment is accounted for in the GDP. The history is extremely long, but starts in Europe for the history of the GDP since the war. It's really a tool for a war economy that has been developed and transmitted into the peace economy. And what you have to keep in mind is that anything that has been developed ever since, so the United Nations system of national accounts, for example, that is the guideline for every single country on this planet to account for its own national economy, is based on the accounting of whatever is exchanged against money. So anything that is not exchanged against money, that is not paid, that is destroyed but never monetized, doesn't exist in any way in the way that you represent the world economy or national economy. And that has been criticized, obviously, and the ones that have criticized this the most strongly were feminists. These books are from the 70s and the 80s, so it's not representative of the actual history of feminist critiques because it started already in the 20s of the past century when the GDP was designed. And if you want to know more about this, I have a paper coming out of this, so I can share. But yeah, basically you have two strands of critiques: feminist critiques that are highlighting how unpaid labor has been invisibilizing the way the world economy has developed throughout the 20th century. And other critics from Latin America and India, whenever the countries had to implement this UN guideline for their own national accounting system, you have a lot of discussions between Latin American experts and Indian experts and economists talking to the headquarters of the UN to say, hey, your guidelines don't fit they absolutely don't fit with the reality of our local economies. How do we do that? And that's a very long story about history of economics in these countries that have developed as a kind of autochthonous production of knowledge to say, you Europeans and North Americans don't understand what our economies are, so your measurements are not fit. It's a long story, but we ended recently in some kind of acknowledgement to say, yeah, right, the environmental depletion or the environmental degradation is not reflected in this system. So we think we are creating growth when actually we're destroying our resources. And since then, there is an explosion, an inflation of accounting systems. So you have forest accounting, ocean accounting, you have biodiversity accounts. And in general, the more you multiply different sorts of calculation and accounts, the less you're actually reforming your core system, because you have your core system and you say, yeah, of course, and then you add this very long list. But in the end, when you need to compare countries, what do you use? The good old GDP without taking care of any of these accounting systems. And obviously, all countries are not recognizing and using the same systems. So at the end, if you want to have a picture of the world economy, you need to keep in mind that actually any numbers that are not produced with the same system. So they are not the same numbers actually, and you don't know what you're looking at and comparing in the end. But obviously, it's a new market, so IBM has been proposing tools to help industries to actually prepare their own accounts to take into account the environment so that when they're audited, they can already provide this kind of spreadsheets. And I want to conclude, and I'm sorry for the stretching time, I want to conclude on the fact that this whole market-based and market-oriented way of finding solutions to change the way Europe is producing its economy or accounting for its economy is actually in a line that is not in correspondence with another trend that has been developing for the past years, that is the recognition of the rights of nature, which has nothing to do with accounting for different types of fishes that you can fish, or no, it's a completely different epistemological way of addressing the problem. And as you can see, Europe is not really part of this discussion right now, but it does exist, and it is developed in different countries. And if you're interested with that, I discovered that there is a tracker, because there are more and more trackers now about the environment. So you have carbon trackers, but you also have eco-jurisprudence monitors. The address is here, but I can send it to you, because you have initiatives that have been proposed and debated and adopted in some countries, and 80% of these initiatives are actually proposed by indigenous people. So this is why international organizations are not completely doomed. There's still forums for adopting different legislation. But that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Johanna. You kept the time. Very good. So don't worry. Yeah, I think it's very. Thank you for the very thorough speech and giving us a very good description on this marketization system of emission trading, but also giving us some thought about alternatives to how to measure a good life, really, right? There's this discussion in Latin America, for example, on buen vivir as an alternative to economic growth. So I think that's very important if we think about ways out of, or alternatives to the climate crisis, and how to measure a good life, really, what is worth living and what should be developed and what should not be developed. We have time for questions now. And before we start with the next presentation. I see one here.
I'm sorry, I missed the beginning, but I think that that's going to be okay for my question. It seems like when you're talking about GDP and some other modes of accounting, that there's a real reliance on the nation state, but as soon as the metric changes or the mode of accounting changes, the nation state really fades away. So in some cases you have nation states, you have provinces, you have cities, and I'm just wondering what you're seeing as the structure for accounting shifts its values, I guess, or the sort of what is being emphasized as valuable, what you see happening to the sort of geopolitical division.
Thank you. Straight to the good questions. Absolutely, the nation state is one of the major problem in this discussion, because and this is why I insisted on the fact that GDP was created as a tool during the war, so that countries could have an idea of what were their resources to mobilize. So human and material resources to mobilize in the war, and what their allies or what their enemies had also, so that they could. And I want to answer using the voices of other people who have been really talking about this, for example, by highlighting the fact that borders are economic sites where you have a lot of invisibilized activities, and I want to cite one person in particular, Sayek Valencia, because she really tried to propose alternative ways of accounting for the economy between Mexico and the US, which is a particular border that confronts the North and the South, or the First World and the Third World, and this border is particularly thick in the sense that it's a huge territory, it's a huge land, and you have billions of dollars that are actually exchanged there, not just because of drugs and prostitution, but also because of all the traffic actually between the north and the south of the continent. And all these fluxes are not recorded anywhere, partly because it's informal, but also because it's in this kind of wasteland of the border. And that's exactly what most of, for example, Latin American women economic thinkers, I would call them like this because they were not economists, but they were actually thinking about the economy, would highlight in Latin America on the fact that you have zones of productions or zones of exchanges that are not reflecting the nation very artificial post-colonial kind of drawing of borders. So I'm not fully answering your question because it's actually there are so much to it that needs to be explored. But what's interesting in the European case is that it was supposed to be this dream of a borderless land, at least inside its borders. But if you think of the fact that also these borders are everywhere, it was supposed to be this dream, which is not anymore because the borders do exist between European countries physically, and if you travel around, and you're actually surprised to see that some countries have completely reinstored their borders. But yeah, it's going to be my answer for right now, but but really the chapter is open for endless discussion about this.
Thanks very much. This is really excellent. I want to ask a question about this slide, or at least like motivated by this slide, and it's about this the proliferation of trackers, right, in response to kind of the measurement deficits of GDP that you've talked about. It seems to me like this one I didn't know about. There are many other carbon trackers, as you said. They seem to be proliferating, and I'm wondering if you have any reflections on like the function they serve in the context of like possible transition at significant institutional levels of how questions of environmental accounting are being deliberated upon. So you're obviously, your research takes you into, as you said, conversations with people who are seeking to implement various forms of environmental accounting at the European level. Do they look at these trackers? Are there some, like even though these are not providing the measurements that are institutionally operative, nevertheless these inform conversations and decision making? Is there like a hierarchy of these trackers where like this is the emerging gold standard in alternative carbon tracking, et cetera? Just do you have anything more to say about this particular form of emerging mediation? Because it's very, it's quite interesting because it's also they widely circulate, they're available on the web, people look at them. What is the kind of impact of these emerging trackers, and how would you describe their potential significance?
So what is fascinating in this story is that commensuration has completely different outcomes depending on the original intention. And so this is very specific on legislation initiatives, but you have indeed trackers that are really designed to compensate the lack of commensuration in some topics. And the thing is that the will to know everything about everything can lead to very different outcomes. In some cases, it can lead to the overexploitation of planetary resources. And I have very specific examples, and maybe you would know it more because you're Canadian, but something happened in Canada that was absolutely terrible, because Canada, I think it was in the 70s, I'm sorry because it's a bit blurry, and because you're asking me the question, I think of Canada. But I think in the 70s, Canada had this problem of shortage of fishes, and they wanted to know a little bit more about the state of their fishes, like where were the fish? And so they developed very highly technological techniques to identify where were the fishes. And thanks to that, the fishery industry actually completely depleted the whole zone of fishes in Canada. So Canada had like a major environmental crisis because of that. Because if you know it all, then you can exploit it all. But on the other side, so sometimes maybe it's better not to know, and so that you can leave it there and give nature its own right that is not to be known by the human extractor. But at the same time, you have a lot of activists who have been highlighting the fact that if you know things but you don't know others, then you're going to create discrepancies that are completely nuts, no? And so this is why the feminists were the first to say, actually, we are working, we are producing, we're making the world go around, and nobody knows about it because it doesn't exist in numbers in a world that recognizes only things that are in numbers. So we need to produce some kind of numbers. It was the case during COVID in the US, for example, with trans communities who have been saying to the legislature that they were suffering maybe more than other communities from COVID. Nobody cared because also nobody had the answer that was made was to say, we don't have any proof of that. So you have communities, trans communities in the US that have started to create their own statistics. And it's interesting because then it's health statistics for the trans community, by the trans community, and indeed it showed that the trans community was dying more of COVID than other communities in the US. It did not help in the end with the whole politics in the US for the trans community. But now we know more about this. So maybe for other countries to help the trans community. I don't know. So it's a little bit a long story short to say that what's interesting is that now when you talk to the European technocrats, which is against another crowd, they will never say anything that is radical about anything. So they will never say, we are commensurating the world so that we can deplete it even more. Or we are commensurating the world so that we can protect and give rights to rivers and glaciers, and obviously no. So they're going to answer with the most beautiful European bureaucratic tongue and say something with a lot of keywords, and which I think we have to analyze at some point, like this new technocratic language that avoids any kind of political discussion. Because what is interesting with the question of the rights of nature is that it is frightening for a lot of people. When Chile drafted a new constitution in 2019 that has been rejected in the end, but after a year of protest, this new constitution proposed rights to nature. And the reaction has been, really, the reaction to that by the conservatives was really that they were afraid. They did not understand how humans could be reduced to the same kind of rights than rivers, which was not the point, because this is not what, and obviously you have a lot of disinformation to decredibilize any kind of attempts to, but it was too radical for them, obviously. And because there are not really any debates, serious debates about that among Europeans, because it looks too radical, or I don't know, then it's a path that we're not exploring when actually the whole world is, I would say, going towards that direction, because if you really want to rethink the protection of the environment, you can't go on with old solutions like the colonial representation of the protection of the environment, because the first laws to protect the environment, to protect forests, there were colonial laws to say that no people should go in that square of forest that us colons have decided to protect on that territory. That's the colonial origin of environmental protection. Or you have this market-based analysis that with the idea that if you are not incentivized, or if you have no perspective for profit, then you're not going to do anything about the environment, which is also not true, in the sense that I think even CEOs of big industries, for some of them, do care if their kids die of cancer because they've been eating too much pesticides. So the balance is not that, actually, and the debate is a bit stuck. That's a bit my point about what Europe, well, the debate in Europe is a bit stuck between very old models of should we do green Keynesianism or market-based? And this is why I wanted to insist on the fact that the markets created to exchange carbon allowances are artificial. They are so artificial. We were talking about neoliberalism yesterday. Nobody believes in free markets anymore to the extent that you can create this bureaucratic markets. This is what it is now. It's a bureaucratic market, so that you would never talk about the rights to nature. That's
Thank you, Johanna. One more time. It was an excellent speech. Thank you.
Thank you.